Hey there, I'm Todd on High, and I've never done a tier list before, so I thought I'd give it a shot for the skills in Division 2. With the new EMP Sticky Bomb and upcoming Healing Trap, both returning and new players are understandably curious about where skills stand, and many videos that examine them are a year old by now. As of Title Update 10, we have 11 types of skills with about 40 variants to choose from, which provides a lot of options and a lot of potential modifiers based on gear and weapon talents. I'll mention some of these as we go along, but I'm primarily going to be focusing on the skills themselves. Before we get started, I just want to say a quick thanks to all my new subscribers. My last few build videos have been getting a ton of likes and comments, and I really appreciate that. I'm working to transition to more essay-focused content, so you may see fewer build videos as time goes on, but I hope you'll stick around. Disclaimers. As I've said before on this channel, I don't PvP in the Division 2, so take this analysis with a grain of salt if you plan to head into the Dark Zone or Conflict. If one of you has done a skill tier list for PvP or have a favorite one, please share it in the comments. This is also just my opinion based on usage and experience, so if you disagree with any of these placements, that's actually a good thing, because it means I don't have all the answers, and I'll be the first to admit that. Bear in mind too that I'm a PS4 player, so some of these details may be slightly different on other platforms. Lastly, I want to encourage you to make your own tier list, especially if you disagree with mine. I learned a lot from making this, and it definitely changed my perception of some of the skills I hadn't used in a while, or in some cases, ever. Trying out each of the skills and thinking critically about their usefulness, strengths, and weaknesses will help you form your own opinion about them, which is really the only opinion that matters. Quick definition of the tiers on the screen, there we go, and you can also find them in the description. And with the disclaimers out of the way, here's my tier list for the Division 2 skills and their variants. Turrets. First up is the Assault Turret, a great all-around damage skill that mimics having an additional player by multiplying your offensive output. I've already gushed through an entire video about how much I love this skill, so I won't belabor the point. It's easy to use, powerful, and doesn't require a lot of effort or specific setups for it to be effective. For all its benefits, like huge range, unlimited ammo, and short cooldown, the few downsides it has are that it is immobile, and the deployment range isn't what I'd call huge, though these are minor complaints. Paired with the Striker Drone, you have one of the meta skill build setups very popular right now. Definitely S tier, no surprise there. Next is the Incinerator Turret. This skill provides passable crowd control in close quarters like corridors and spawn points, but it has several drawbacks. First, being a turret, it is immobile, which is normally not as much of an issue, but this turret's range is not great. Worse, and this can't be overstated, you yourself are immobile while placing it. And with the way it sprays back and forth slowly, it's easy for enemies to just avoid it. Not to mention, if you're a scrub like me or just not paying attention, it is entirely possible to throw the turret and have fire facing you instead of your enemy. In Division 1, it used to have essentially the same targeting and range of motion as the Division 2 Assault Turret. Now though, it sprays fire back and forth like a really dangerous lawn sprinkler. While not completely worthless, its various drawbacks land it in D tier. Then we have the Sniper Turret. A good single target damage skill, this turret can land massive shots from range. Usage of this skill isn't exactly complex, but turret placement becomes even more important here than it is with other turrets, since placing this turret on the ground makes it about as useful as the remote pulse. Sniper Turret pairs well with exotics like Acosta Go Bag and BTSU gloves because if the turret is deployed while overcharged, it remains overcharged even after the talent goes on cooldown. One major downside though is that usage requires you to aim and select each target, or what I like to call babysit every shot. The skill essentially goes to waste if you aren't babysitting it. which distracts you from doing actual gun damage, which may not be a bad thing depending on your build. Despite the short cooldowns between shots and for the turret itself, and the decent damage output, the requirement of targeting each shot and its ability to only hit one target at a time push the sniper turret down to B tier. Finally in the turret category is the artillery turret. This thing is a tale of two extremes. It can pump out massive area damage, but can also very easily kill the operator, especially in close quarters. Aiming and firing can seem clunky until you get the rhythm down, and even then, aiming isn't very precise. Not only is the targeting reticle difficult to get used to for enemies even just across the room, but the explosion shakes the screens of you and your teammates depending on proximity, which can be really annoying. While effective, it takes some getting used to, and is one case where I'll say it's okay to place your turret on the ground for some ceiling clearance. Having to babysit each shot is less of an issue here since it's area damage rather than single target, and the time it takes the turret to fire and reload gives you ample opportunity to fire your gun. It also procs the bleed effect, which makes it useful for combos like the Vial Mask and/or Eclipse Protocol, but due to its volatility and the requirement of using the Demolitionist spec, this beast settles in at A tier. Drones. A fan favorite, the Striker drone has definitely had its ups and downs over time. From the time a drone was teased in the first Division 1 trailer, players were clamoring to see exactly what this tech can do. Turns out, as of Title Update 10 in Division 2, the Striker drone can harangue and kill enemies very well, flushing them out of cover, drawing attention from you, and proccing various do skill damage based talents like Spark and InSync. Its high mobility and decent damage, not to mention beefiness at higher skill tiers, make it a go-to skill for many players in Title Update 10 all the way into Legendary difficulty. Paired with the Assault Turret and the right build, the Striker drone is fantastic in PVE, definitely S tier, unless or until it gets nerfed. Next up is the opposite of a fan favorite, the Bombardier drone. If this skill actually worked properly, it would drop bombs in a straight path from one chosen point to another. It would also be significantly higher up on this list. Unfortunately, this drone has been a broken mess probably since the game launched. About half the time, it will run into terrain and die, similar to a Firefly, but much more frequently. Slightly less often, it will simply refuse to function, and upon your completion of the targeting sequence, the drone will explode like you cancelled it and go on a brief cooldown. The scant few times it does work, and you're able to target properly, this drone can drop some powerful bombs on your enemies. Or on yourself if you're unlucky or careless. As you might expect, the targeting of this drone is a bit clunky, which only adds to the frustration. With the way enemies hide in cover, this skill could be quite useful and enjoyable, but without some serious developer attention, this thing will remain nothing more than a meme. For its inability to consistently function, the Bombardier crashes into F tier. The first defensive skill in this list is the Fixer drone. This gadget provides sustained passive healing over time and can be assigned to an ally. It requires no real effort to use and does not require you to stay within a circle or a cloud to receive your healing. However, the healing is fairly weak with low or no skill tier, and it can't heal you while sprinting, and it does float above you while you're in cover, making it vulnerable even when you're not. It pairs well with the shield, though that's situational at best, and is a big help if you use the Companion or Kinetic Momentum talents. Otherwise, especially when compared to things like the Reinforcer and Mender Seeker, it's just a generic healing skill which lands it solidly in the center at C tier. Further in the drone category, we have another defensive skill, the Defender drone. This hovers near you and blocks some incoming fire for a brief period. While that sounds useful, the amount of incoming fire you'll often see makes the drone a little inadequate. Plus, against certain types of enemies like warhounds and mini-tanks, the drone is laughably useless. If only we could get Keener's version of the drone, am I right? Prior to making this video, I had not used this skill much outside of some early attempts at Conflict, where it could be used alongside the old Berserk talent to keep you alive but with low armor. With how much damage heroic and higher enemies do nowadays, this drone just isn't very effective for PvE at all, which is why it's a step below the repair drone at D tier. Our last drone is the Tactician drone, used exclusively by the Sharpshooter specialization. This skill seemed pretty useful when Division 2 had first come out, but it's become clear over time that enemy visibility is a lot less of an issue than it seems. Not to mention, there are other skills that do this better, cheaper, faster, and don't require a specific specialization to use. This thing is clunky as hell, especially when you transition from the outside to inside a building. Even with high skill tier, which no sniper build will have, the drone does next to nothing, including 0 damage increase, but it has this ridiculously long duration. While pulsing enemies has utility, especially in inclement weather, and if you're using the spotter talent on your chest piece, the Tactician drone is essentially an entire skill slot devoted to manually doing something the Technician Underbarrel mod already does. This thing is garbage, don't even bother with it. F tier, obviously. Seeker Mines. Next up are Seeker Mines, and we're starting out with the Explosive Seeker. This big boom was a precursor to the Sticky Bomb returning, since it is more of a single target or small area explosion. The quote-unquote big damage is a trade-off for its long cooldown and its ability to proc the bleed status effect. However, both of these are laughably inadequate when compared to other skills. Just look at the side-by-side damage comparison to the Cluster Seeker, and remember that one of them can be multiplied by 10 or so. According to Reddit user
Trzebiatw.
Breakdown of explosive skills and builds posted during Title Update 9, it is much more of a PvP skill, as there's no reason to use it over the Cluster Seeker in PvE, and there are other better single target damage skills. On my list, it lands at D tier. Then we have the Airburst Seeker, which is slightly different from the Airburst Seekers that the Black Tusk use, which are more explosive and less fire, and also different than what it was back in Division 1. This skill causes a fire effect for crowd control, but it does so using a similar targeting reticle as the artillery turret. Unlike other Seeker Mines that you can throw and then have them seek whatever targets they find, you deploy the airburst next to you, then choose a target area, and it makes a zoom noise to go blow up. The burn duration is long and it has a decent cooldown, but the effect radius isn't exactly huge, and the deployment and targeting is a bit cumbersome. Not only are there better ways to apply fire at a distance, there are also better Seeker Mines, so this one gets kicked down to C tier. Without question, one of the strongest skills in the game is the Cluster Seeker. Not only can this skill hit numerous separate targets with one deployment, it can be thrown quite a ways, allowing you to engage or destroy from a distance. It also doesn't succumb to the issues that a Firefly or drone might as far as exploding against cover or obstacles. That being said, it has a fairly hefty cooldown to trade off for those benefits, and it's common for enemies, particularly elites, to dodge out of the way of the explosion. The game can also be incredibly picky about what it will allow the Seekers to land on. This leads to failed throws, which means a brief animation lock, or wasted throws where your Seekers don't even explode. That's just me nitpicking though. The damage potential of this skill is insanely strong, especially when combined with talents like Spike, Skilled, and Tech Support, which puts the Cluster Seeker solidly at S tier. The last of the Seekers is the only defensive one, the Mender Seeker, and is specific to the Survivalist specialization. Similar in concept to the Repair Drone, the Mender Seeker will chase you and your teammates around, dropping heal clouds much like the reinforcing chem launcher. While the Seeker itself is mobile, the heal clouds are not, so the mobility is less of an advantage in this case, though the Mender Seeker now has a mind of its own and will heal your teammates if it can, regardless of your armor level in some cases. While also a fairly generic heal skill, the Mender Seeker does have a small advantage over the drone in that it doesn't hover, giving it a better chance to survive during encounters. Even so, the actual heal over time is minuscule without stacking skill tiers and or repair skills, which is unfortunate given that it's a specialization skill. Not useless, but D tier nonetheless. Chem launchers. Many of us wanted the sticky bomb at launch with Division 2, but what we got was the chem launcher. Despite multiple changes to the control scheme and a nerf to remove a stacking heal effect, the Reinforcer Chem Launcher has remained a solid option for mobile and effective healing. Not only can you drop a heal cloud at your feet, you can launch a chem round at your teammates from quite a distance. The heal can be quite weak if you're stacking a lot of armor, but with a low skill tier and an all-red build, it does heal surprisingly quickly, unlike the Repair Drone or Mender Seeker, so long as you stay in the cloud. The short cooldown per charge and the fact that your heal cloud can't be killed like the drone or seeker make the Reinforcer a versatile choice for a healing skill. S tier for sure. Next up is the Firestarter Chem Launcher. Similar to the grenades used by the Cleaner Thrower, this chem launcher fires a round of flammable gas which can then be ignited by gunfire or other means to damage the enemies and apply the burn status effect. This provides decent crowd control plus a damage over time effect, both of which can be enhanced using certain gear. As with the Reinforcer, the short cooldown and distance it can be shot give this skill some big advantages over others. Fantastic for status effect builds. As for drawbacks, the burn status effect sometimes leads to unpredictable results or results you're unable to capitalize on, like heavies being unaffected or mobs hiding in cover despite being on fire. Also, the general clunkiness of the chem launcher can be frustrating at times. The wind-up phase of switching to the chem launcher, aiming, firing, switching back to a gun, and firing to ignite the gas can feel slow and comes with a bit of animation lock. Add all that up, and you wind up with A tier. You might assume the Oxidizer Chem Launcher is only useful against metallic and armored enemies, until you face rogue agents or Keener and have it used against you. Though it does not apply a status effect, this skill damages enemies who stay within the cloud it creates. The Oxidizer can hit enemies through walls and cover, so it's great to kill things that get stuck in their spawn point or to flush out enemies who are just hiding. Enemies are aware of it enough to dodge out of the target zone, but generally end up walking back into the cloud anyway. Plus, unlike the nerfed Reinforcer, the damage tick from the Oxidizer does stack. The targeting can be clunky, just as with other chem launchers, much like the grenade launcher. On the one hand, it doesn't need to be ignited like the Firestarter, but on the other hand, it only damages and does not apply any sort of status effect, so it can't be used to proc things like Creeping Death or Eclipse Protocol. This drops it down to B tier. Last up for chem launchers, we have the Riot Foam, which is quickly gaining traction in my mind as one of the most useful crowd control skills in the game. As I mentioned in my Creeping Trauma V2 video, the Ensnare effect doesn't only halt enemies, it pops them out of cover as well. Until they free themselves, the enemy stands mostly still, at least in comparison to what they usually do, and compared to what they do under other status effects. It's a solid skill for halting a group or interrupting a heavy gunner so he can be focused down. As for drawbacks, it's essentially useless against mechanical enemies, and again, being a chem launcher, it can be clunky to aim, which makes it easy to miss your targets, but its overall effectiveness puts it up to A tier. Pulses. Onto the pulse skills, which, unlike the chem launchers, are very much a mixed bag. First up is the Scanner Pulse, a skill that only provides a damage increase when it's in overcharge and otherwise is only used to identify and mark enemies. For a recon skill, it does edge slightly ahead of the tactician drone and even the remote pulse, especially with something like the Night Watcher lowering the cooldown even further. But unless you're in a scenario with low visibility, there's just no need for something like this. It may help you feel better to see where enemies are, but many skills like turrets and drones help you spot enemies simply by offering to target them. Not to mention, the Technician spec provides a great underbarrel mod for pulsing anything you shoot at. Scanner Pulse may be great during one of those epic DC thunderstorms, otherwise it's more of a security blanket than anything else. D tier at best. Jammer Pulse is up next, and it is without a doubt one of the most situationally useful skills in the game. Obviously, I'm a huge fan of comboing this with the Vile Mask, but it's a solid skill in its own right. Pretty much a must-have for the Razorback fight in Operation Dark Hours, Jammer will damage and stun mini-tanks, warhounds, and drones, as well as disrupt other tech like Keener's mystery boxes on Liberty Island. The few drawbacks it has, like it not actually damaging human enemies by itself, and the fact that the skill must be quickly charged up before it fires off, are noteworthy, but not a big deal. Obviously, this skill would also have utility in PvP, though its range isn't exactly huge with low skill tier. Since it does apply a status effect and works so great against drones, the Jammer Pulse comes in handy against more factions than just the Black Tusk, which lands it on A tier. The Remote Pulse gets my nomination for the most useless skill in PvE. Honestly, I tried to come up with a PvE scenario where the Remote Pulse would be useful with the current state of the game, not to mention more useful than Scanner Pulse or the Tactician Drone. I have failed, and I have no idea why this skill is even in the game, so I must conclude that its only utility is found in PvP or the Dark Zone. Unlike Scanner Pulse, it doesn't even tell you how many threats are found, it only highlights them. While the skill stays out for a while and has a relatively short cooldown, I can wholeheartedly say, who cares? I have never, not once, seen anyone use this skill in the thousands of hours I've been matchmaking in this game, and I was reluctant to even matchmake with it on. The epitome of F tier. F for fucking useless. The final pulse is the only specialization-specific crowd control skill, the Banshee Pulse. Unlike other pulses, Banshee fires in a cone rather than a sphere, and applies the disorient effect, which typically sets enemies stumbling solely forward in a predictable manner. Though it doesn't do any damage on its own, this pulse has a fairly decent cooldown. Hitting a fresh wave of enemies with Banshee can make for an easy room due to how debilitating the disorient effect is. That being said, without a properly spec'd status effect build, the effect doesn't last very long, even with 6 skill tiers. Like the Jammer, the Banshee Pulse must be charged up before firing, which will change some properties about the cone of effect. Alongside the Riot Foam grenade, the Banshee Pulse adds a considerable amount of crowd control to the Gunner spec. This one comes in at A tier. Hives. All hives can be thrown a decent ways, have good range with higher skill tiers, and can be picked up and redeployed until they run out of charges. As the only skill that can bring an agent back from a downed or dead state, not to mention doing so automatically except in PvP, the Revive Hive has been popular since day one, despite its many issues. Unfortunately, recent changes have affected its cooldown and revealed how much players rely on it even in non-raid scenarios. Useful? Absolutely, but so are training wheels. Its unique ability forces a begrudging S-tier ranking, but I recommend against coming to rely on this as a crutch outside of raid content, where revives are limited. Next up is the Restorer Hive, which is easy to confuse with the Reviver, although this one is just an AoE healing skill and does passably well at that. Nowhere near as powerful or as ranged as the Black Tusk Lunchbox, this hive shoots charges out to heal agents and can be picked up and redeployed as you advance. Alongside the Reinforcer Chem Launcher, this hive makes for a decent healer setup. It doesn't provide any other benefits, such as status effect immunity like the Immunizer in Division 1, and the cooldown can be pretty hefty at 30 plus charges, so there's definitely room for improvement. Overall, this skill is helpful but not always necessary, and therefore slides into B tier. A quick aside regarding healing. The necessity of a dedicated healer is an interesting subject in this game. I've broached the topic only rarely on this channel because of my experience with it, and to an extent, the lack thereof. Even a scrub like me can put together a build that heals. The question is really, am I contributing to the party's success by bringing this? Where this is anything from a healer build, to a CC build, to a turret drone skill build, to your attempt at an all-red build. Outside of legendary and raid content, a dedicated healer probably isn't needed. But that doesn't mean it isn't a fun playstyle or that it negatively impacts efficiency. Plus, it's good to practice before you go into those higher difficulties. When built certain ways, a healer can do more than just replenish armor, especially with effects like Future Initiative's ground control, empathic resolve, and overclock. The point is, the necessity of healing is an ongoing and nuanced discussion. See this thread if you're curious. The Booster Hive provides small buffs to you and your teammates, and that's about it. Back in the olden days, this was a popular skill in PvP, giving you the ability to run up on your opponents faster. Nowadays, it no longer provides the speed boost or a weapon damage boost, opting instead for defensive buffs like hazard protection and melee damage. It makes me miss the ammo crate from Division 1. While it does provide some useful support, I don't think it fulfills a specific need outside of potential raid fights that use exotic damage, and I certainly don't see it in heavy usage when I matchmake. Not exactly a waste of a skill, but there are better and worse options in this list. C tier all the way. For a long time, I avoided the Stinger Hive because my perception of its limited range. However, with the right combination of aggressive playstyle and talents available as of Title Update 10, this skill can put out insane damage. Not only does it do explosive type damage, making it buffed by things like China Light 1-piece and Grupo Sombra 2-piece bonuses, it also inflicts bleed, so it's great for status effect builds. Incredibly versatile, practically the only things that hold it back are its throw range and effect radius, which are actually adequate for most fights. It's very useful in close quarters where the enemies aren't able to avoid it as easily. The limited charges and cooldown aren't as much of a drawback as they seem, which knocks this one up to B tier. Added with the Technician spec, the Artificer Hive buffs and refreshes the skills of you and your teammates. Similar to the Booster, it provides some support and may come in handy under certain scenarios, while at the same time begging the question of who this is really for. If your team is composed of multiple skill builds, such as skill-based CC and/or healing, or if you're running multiple people with turret drone, the Artificer can be a big buff to all the deployed skills. On the other hand, the usefulness of a skill shouldn't necessarily be tied to party composition. Some recent discussion, yes, again on Reddit, reveals the Artificer to be often misunderstood and underappreciated. While definitely useful, this skill has its limitations in casual content, though it certainly shouldn't be ignored when theory crafting or planning for static group content. A begrudging B tier. Let's move on. Fireflies. Formerly somewhat of a default crowd control skill, recent changes to the Blinder Firefly have knocked it down a peg with regard to cooldown time and length of effect. While blinding enemies is one of the more useful crowd control methods, the Firefly doesn't auto-target well at all, and is prone to running into terrain, walls, or other cover and either going immediately on cooldown, or missing one or more of your targets as a result. Its range and aiming are improved from where they used to be, so the Blinder Firefly remains a somewhat solid skill for halting enemies and making them vulnerable. Useful, but B tier. A big surprise from making this video was my discovery of the Burster Firefly. This skill attaches explosives to enemies that then detonate when 2 or more of the enemies are close together. In theory it sounds kind of cool, but in practice, it's even cooler than it sounds. If you're undetected and can launch this against enemies standing around near each other, you're in for a good time. With a high skill tier, not only is the damage output quite large, but you can also use this on a high number of targets. As long as those enemies are not spread out across an entire block, this skill will have them exploding all over the place. Unfortunately, the Firefly sometimes runs into things, plus as an encounter goes on, the enemy numbers dwindle, ideally anyway, so this skill's requirement of 2 or more enemies being close together becomes harder to meet the longer a firefight lasts. If it were more reliable, this skill could almost be as strong as the Cluster Seeker, but its drawbacks drop it down to B tier. Next up is the Demolisher Firefly, which attacks weak points and triggers environmental explosions. This is good, but generally speaking, once those have been expended in a room or on a wave, the skill may as well stay on cooldown. This makes it not a great choice for skill damage builds, but that doesn't make it useless. A recent Reddit thread argued that Demolisher could be the best skill in the game for its ability to prevent archetypes like medics and engineers from deploying their skill proxies. Provided your aim is good, the skill is almost more useful at low skill tiers as it is high, so long as you target the enemies and not the environment. Since it's not specifically about doing damage, the Demolisher provides a support option for DPS players who have low or no skill tier. As with other Fireflies though, it's a bit fragile and it can end up a victim of its own explosions, so the Demolisher sits at B tier with the others. Shields, and another quick aside. To be honest, shield builds are not required for most of the content in this game. There are definitely effective and fun ways to play shield builds, but the lowered mobility makes you a very easy target. Shields can be difficult for some players to use effectively, and all shield builds limit your weapon choices. I don't hate shields in this game, but I think they penalize solo players in a way. Many of the mobs cower and hide, not for nothing as they have powerful range attacks in most cases, but it makes relying on a shield and no offensive skill incredibly tedious. If you mostly play solo, shields are not worth much to you aside from novelty and fun, but in group play they can make a huge difference in the success of a squad. Also, it's always going to be an uphill battle to be effective in this game when most, if not all, of your core attributes are blue. As if to emphasize what I dislike so much about shields, the Bulwark is here to give you full body cover at the cost of using anything but a pistol. Until the second raid was added to bring a second exotic pistol into the mix, the Liberty has really been the only way to effectively run this shield at all, and now you can run it with Foundry Bulwark for plug-and-play survivability. The good part of the Bulwark shield is that it lets you pretend this game has tanking, but being relegated to pistol usage with hardly any decent options is not a great trade-off. Great protection, but the best offense is not a good defense, so this one lands at C tier. If you've been following this channel at all the past few months, then you've probably seen my Tardigrade True Patriot ACS-12 Crusader Shield build video, which highlighted some strengths of the Crusader Shield, namely that you can use real guns with it. At least shotguns and assault rifles anyway. The drawback is, of course, your legs and head are left somewhat vulnerable, but this at least allows for more variety in how you approach pretending to tank. If you're using the gunner variation of that build, this shield is definitely the way to go, but for Firewall you'd obviously want to switch to the Striker Shield. For allowing me to use a real weapon, the Crusader Shield lands in B tier. In a somewhat gimmicky display, the Deflector Shield allows you to block incoming bullets back at enemies to mitigate the damage they might otherwise have done. While this may be incredibly fun to mess around with and make cool YouTube videos with, its actual utility is undercut by having far more useful shield options, and the fact that you are once again stuck with only a pistol while this shield is deployed. Unless you really enjoy the Liberty, or have done Iron Horse a lot, or saved your last Mozambique special, it's just difficult to be competitive even with other shield builds. Ironically, the Deflector shield is probably the most solo-friendly of the shields, but it is kind of self-defeating in that way. Rule number 1 of shield use is don't be between your teammates and the enemy, because you will end up blocking friendly bullets. With the pistol limitation and the practical requirement of being an obstacle to get use out of this skill, it drops down to C tier. As mentioned a moment ago, the Striker shield is firewall specific and actually provides some great buffs for certain up-close playstyles, like debuffing with True Patriot and Opportunistic, or overpowering with Intimidate and Adrenaline Rush. Not only will you get a good damage buff for enemies kept in a cone in front of the shield, there's also a rear cone that only your allies can see, and they'll get a buff for standing in it. With the same few weaknesses that the Crusader shield has, those additional buffs and the ability to use a real weapon alongside this shield push it up to a solid A tier. Decoy. I've made fun of it before, but let's have a frank conversation about the Decoy skill. This creates a hologram of a human and is one of the few ways to manipulate the threat mechanics in this game. As indicated in my Assault Turret 101 video, I was more than ready to write this skill off as worthless F-tier garbage, but a recent Reddit thread has changed my mind a bit on it. Of course, the skill has utility alongside the Mantis exotic, but in addition to the overcharge easily supplied by something like Acosta's Go Bag, the Decoy can be repeatedly thrown to distract the enemy. It's an interesting implementation with a healer build. Apparently, the threat generation is so powerful you can raise dead players out in the open. Still, I don't think throwing it between your team and the enemy is really capturing the spirit of the skill, and the throw range is unfortunately not all that large, so this one comes in at C tier. Traps. The trap skill was an interesting addition with Warlords of New York, the first variant of which is a crowd controller, the Shock Trap. This skill deploys several small devices that explode when an enemy gets close and applies the shock effect. While shock is a decent status effect, and there have been documented instances of this skill stun-locking certain enemies, humans tend to kneel when shocked, which may make it harder to shoot and generally kill them. Also, you can't throw it very far, your teammates can get shocked by it, and the distribution of traps can sometimes be laughably poor. Definitely some utility here, especially in rusher-heavy fights like Outcast missions, which places it on the B tier. Sticky Bombs. One of the best, quickest to deploy, and easiest to use skills in the First Division game was the Sticky Bomb. With variants such as the BFB and the Flashbang, it became kind of a crowd favorite. Added with Warlords, this version unfortunately feels much more like an afterthought. Not as quick to deploy, but still very effective, the explosive Sticky Bomb provides a massive burst of damage in a targeted area. The trade-off of this is a relatively long cooldown, especially with low skill tier, though not quite in the neighborhood of the Cluster Seeker. Like a big, fast grenade, it's a targeted explosion that you can either stick directly to an enemy or to the terrain near multiple enemies. The targeting reticle is at least easier to use than the chem launcher, but it's not exactly perfect. With the right setup and attributes, this skill is both fun and effective, landing it solidly in A tier. The second Sticky Bomb variant is the Burn Sticky Bomb, adding a small crowd control effect and lowering the overall damage that the skill puts out. While much more straightforward to aim than the Airburst Seeker, the Burn Sticky Bomb brings along all the benefits and drawbacks of other fire skills, as well as the relatively long cooldown of a Sticky Bomb. I won't deny the gratification of sticking it to an enemy and detonating to create a fiery mess, but every time I use this skill, I find myself wishing that it did more, or had a wider area of effect. Definitely one of those skills where you can get really good with it if it's your preference to use, but its limited target area puts it decidedly behind other methods. Without Eclipse Protocol, this skill is lucky to hit B tier. And last on the list, we have the EMP Sticky Bomb variant. Essentially a concentrated blast of EMP that you fire at a single target or small area, this bomb stuns and damages mechanical enemies. Against humans, it applies the disrupt effect, but does not do any damage or really even stun them. Against drones, especially when there are multiple of them, the jammer pulse would undoubtedly be more effective. However, in certain fights against the Black Tusk, this sticky bomb could definitely come in handy. The damage, even buffed, was a bit unsatisfying for sacrificing an entire skill slot to something so situational. It doesn't have much in the way of utility, especially against other factions. Useful, but not the best, this one finishes out the C tier. And there you go, all 40 or so skills as of Title Update 10, ranked in tiers. Agree? Disagree? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoy this sort of content, please like, subscribe, and check out some of my other videos. Good luck out there, agents. Cheers.